Well, I think when they joined us in 1963, I think he turned the club round. And that's the greatest thing he could ever done, because Samat was recovering from the Munich air disaster, and they won their first trophy in 1963, just after they signed Denis. So I think his part they played at that time was so vital to the renovation of the team. And I think that most people will always remember that signing from Italy was it was a cornerstone of their future success.
Get back to the boss in just a quick second. But remember, if you like this video, please like, share and subscribe. And don't forget to click the notification button so that you know when the next Big D video drops. And if you've got something to say, if you feel as though I've missed something, if you feel as though the guys in the clips have missed something, or if you think I'm talking nonsense, you know where to put it. Put it in the comments. I read all of the comments. And yeah, this is a little bit of a somber video, because this is a little bit of a video on the late, great Denis Law, the king of Old Trafford, as he was called. And in this video, Sir Alex Ferguson is going to be giving a little bit of an emotional tribute to the former Manchester United player himself. And afterwards, I'm going to be giving my thoughts on Denis Law and what he means to Manchester United as well. So stick around after that, and any thoughts, stick them in the comments. Here's the boss.
Sir Alex, another very sad day in this football club as we mourn the loss of Denis Law. What's your memories of him, firstly, as a player?
Well, his debut for Scotland was at Cardiff Park, Arnhem Park it would be called at the time, and he scored, and the goal was a real fluke, because the goalkeeper Kelsey came running out and whacked the ball and hit Denis in the back and in the net. So that was his start of his scoring career with Scotland. And at that time he was only 18 years of age, of course, and it was unknown to most Scots fans. But obviously they'd done their homework, because he was in the Huddersfield first team at the time, and come from Aberdeen, of course, as a schoolboy. But once you knew Denis and you saw him play, you said, well, this is a player. You know, it's a strange thing that it took me years to actually meet him. And I was the chairman of the Players' Union in Scotland, and we had this arrangement with the other alliances of the football associations in other countries, and they had a game in Paris, and Denis played in the first half. I didn't play, and he came off at half-time, and he says, where can I get a cup of tea? You know, that was Denis's favourite cup of tea. He loved a cup of tea. I went upstairs, and there's a saying in Scotland when people get carried away, who do you think you are, Denis Law? And it's just it's a fact. And I don't know why I did it, but I asked them for his autograph. And they said, no, I don't. I says, who do you think you are, Denis Law? And Denis is sitting there. He says, you had it. I said, oh, God, what a start.
Because this is someone you've described as your hero.
I know. He was the best Scottish player of all time. I think Denis kind of goes thereafter, and some fantastic players, obviously. But Denis was a fantastic player. I mean, he summarised a Scotsman. Fight anyone, around an empty house, like just Christmas in Aberdeen. He was an incredible human being. And the later years, when I came to Aberdeen, he was doing a radio thing, and we were in Greece, and we're sitting in the airport, and there was a bit of delay, and I don't know why I said that to him, because we weren't doing great at the time. And I says, why don't you come in for a cup of tea sometime? He says, I'm the last person you want to come to the cliff for a cup of tea. I says, why? He says, you want the front page, you're press with full Denis Law goes to help Aberdeen United. I said, oh, yeah, I can understand. But we won the league. The next week, he was in for a cup of tea.
There we go.
It was, and I went to see him just a couple of months ago, and he wasn't doing well.
A fantastic player, an absolute legend of this club, but as a person, someone who you created a real friendship with over the years, and all the memories people talk about, they all say what a great sense of humour he had, a real cheeky side. Is that how you will remember him?
100%. He had that with a wee gift of taking the mickey out of you when you actually don't know. He's throwing wee quips in. But he was a really giant. The great thing was he didn't use his fame. He was so level-headed, down to earth. You say, well, this guy's he's got these caps for Scotland. He's the greatest, the kings in Old Trafford. It's an interesting thing. Why did they call him the king? Because you had George Best, Bobby Charlton, the greatest English player of all time, fantastic player for our club, but they called Denis the king. And I think it's something to do with the determination and the will to win that he showed every time he went on that football field. And that's what he was. He was a really competitive human being. And no matter which game, that was always there. That life-like image you have of Denis Law, fighting against centre-halves. The goalkeeper dropped the ball, he was right over the top of him. He was such a competitive human being that I think it was a natural thing for the supporters to associate him as their king.
And just finally, what does he mean to this football club?
Well, I think when he joined us in 1963, I think he turned the club round. And that's the greatest thing he could ever done, because Samat was recovering from the Munich air disaster, and they won their first trophy in 1963, just after they signed Denis. So I think his part they played at that time was so vital to the renovation of the team. And I think that most people will always remember that signing from Italy was a cornerstone of their future success.
Denis Law. Yeah, it's an interesting situation when it comes to Denis Law, I feel, because he played in a team, a front three even, that you could probably argue is the greatest front three of all time. Because you had Denis Law, Sir Bobby Charlton, and George Best. And you compare that front three to great front threes of modern football. Let's compare it to the Barcelona front three. Lionel Messi, Luis Suarez, and Neymar. Say Neymar if you want. I mean, George Best was as talented as Lionel Messi. Certainly wasn't as professional. I will concede that. But he was certainly as talented. Luis Suarez. Well, let's go with Neymar. Well, I'd rather have Sir Bobby Charlton in my team than Neymar. All day, every day. And Denis Law and Luis Suarez. Well, I mean, I think I'd have Denis Law in my side over Luis Suarez. And when I think about those players, when I think about Luis Suarez, actually, as I'm, sort of musing here about the great man, there were kind of similarities between them in their attitude towards the game. I mean, Denis Law didn't bite anyone or do anything like that, but he was nasty, as Sir Alex alludes there in the clip. He was a nasty fighting striker, he was a very typical Scotsman, and the Big D's half Scottish, he can say that. And most of my family love football and played football, and the ones that did play football were nasty fighters and competitive and all that good stuff. But the reason I sort of make that comparison is, everyone knows who Luis Suarez is, everyone clearly knows who Neymar and Lionel Messi are, and people know who Bobby Charlton and George Best were, but Denis Law seems to, I'm not going to say forgotten, because he's certainly not forgotten, certainly by Manchester United fans. I mean, he's got 2 statues at Old Trafford. He's got the Holy Trinity statue outside the ground, and he's actually got his own statue in the Stretford end. But he doesn't seem to have the same profile, and it just makes me think of players back then. I mean, there are so many phenomenal players, but because it was so long ago, and it was because it was before the television breakthrough, where football was beamed across all of our screens post the 1966 World Cup. There seems to be a whole generation of player that were forgotten by, say, the masses. I mean, I can't imagine you could go to Brazil and ask them if they know who Denis Law was. I can't imagine it. Or maybe in some countries in Europe. But Denis Law was an absolutely lethal striker, and he's quite rightly considered the greatest Scottish player of all time. And Scotland have produced some phenomenal players, including players like Kenny Dalglish, for instance, Alan Hansen, for instance, John Robertson, European Cup winner at Nottingham Forest. But they say that Denis Law was the best. And out of that amazing front three for Manchester United, Denis Law was the first one to win the Ballon d'Or in 1964. And I've always been a big proponent of one man doesn't make a team, but one man makes a difference. And it's no coincidence that what Alex Ferguson says there, that when they signed Denis Law, it was straight after that they won their first major trophy, and that was the FA Cup. Now, to put that into context, back in the 60s, the FA Cup was still considered one of the best things you could win. It was up there. I mean, you get 100,000 people at Wembley Stadium watching it. All the big teams wanted to win it. It's not quite the same trophy as it now as it was back then, but back then it was like a World Cup final. It was like a European Cup final in Britain. Anyway, in fact, there used to be the FA Cup final abroad on the continent, and you hear stories of famous players in subsequent years, like talking about how they used to love to watch teams like Manchester United in the FA Cup final, because that was perhaps the only game that they could see on their TVs in Denmark and Norway and Germany and all those places. So he inspired them to win their first major trophy post Munich air disaster. And then obviously Bobby Charlton came into his own, and he won the Ballon d'Or in 66 after winning the World Cup. And then eventually George Best comes along and wins it in 1968. And I just find that kind of fascinating. There's a whole history of player that just seems to be forgotten. And I mean, there was loads from back then. I mean, Di Stefano's certainly not forgotten, but you don't see a lot of footage about him. You don't see a lot of people putting him in the lists of the greatest players ever. I mean, if he's in the list, he's maybe 12th or 13th, but Di Stefano dominated world football back in that era, and Denis Law won the Ballon d'Or around that era. I mean, there was players like Omar Savori, who was Argentinian, who they reckoned was better than Diego Maradona, but no one knows because Serie A wasn't televised back then. So it just makes you wonder where players like Denis Law, Omar Savori, Eusebio, players like this would rank if we had all of their games and goals televised all around the world now. I mean, you could probably get a lot of them on YouTube now, but it's not celebrated as some of the players that play now. And to think, Denis Law was scoring 30, 40 goals a season. He would rifle them in. And this was during an age when the pitches were, at times, were like swamps. They weren't the plush cricket fields that they play on now. They were bubbly, they were hard, there was no undersoil heating. The ball was like a brick. The boots were tough, heavy leather, and they were headering these balls. And also, the attackers weren't protected as much as they are now. I mean, defenders would go out to try and break players' legs. I mean, there was a player called Chopper Harris. I think he used to play for Chelsea, and he was called Chopper for a reason. But you still had players like Denis Law banging them in, week out. And all kinds of goals. Volleys, headers, tap-ins, long shots, acrobatic goals. He was phenomenal. I'm wondering if the fact that he didn't play the European Cup final in 1968 perhaps played a role in him not perhaps getting as much adulation from the wider footballing community over the years. Or maybe even it was his move to Manchester City and the mythical goal, backheel goal that they say relegated Manchester United, perhaps played a part in that as well. Who knows? And I don't think he played a World Cup either. Could be wrong on that, but I don't think he did. So again, that might have been an issue, and he wasn't sort of flamboyant like George Best, and he wasn't necessarily the leader of Manchester United like Bobby Charlton was. So, as Ferguson there said that he was quite level-headed. So, the fact that he was just happy to just score the goals and that was it, was enough for him, and that contributed to that. But yeah, I mean, I remember reading an interesting story about Denis Law because he was injured for the European Cup final in 1968, and he didn't watch it. And I think he was in hospital, and they asked him if he wanted to watch the match, the roll of TV in, and I don't think he did. I'm going to have to check that one out because I need to clarify that. But it was something like that, and he was just that kind of guy. But Denis Law, what a player he was. I mean, I appreciate him. I think we could do with him now, I tell you that. Because, yeah, what a player. Anyway, God bless your soul, Denis Law. Hope you rest easy. But what do you guys think? Do you know a lot about Denis Law? Do you know a lot about players from the past? Who are your favourite players from the past who you feel as though don't get enough credit in today's game? Please put your thoughts in the comments. Anyway, big deal. See you in the next one.